What is different in the P3 model is that they contract out for a long, in this case 30-year period, the ongoing maintenance of that project. So the highway in this case, they've contracted out the removal, the clearing of the streets, the maintenance of it over the long term, crack filling and all that stuff. That is all gone. That is what makes P3s different. But generally speaking, the argument is it all falls under the umbrella of the private sector is more efficient. And that's just a given. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not necessarily arguing that's the case, but that's the overwhelming argument. If they tie a number of things together, if we can get one person to design it, and that same person to build it, and that same person to maintain it, or organization, over the lifetime of the project, they will build it and design it with that in mind, that they are going to have to be the ones to maintain it. So the theory, at least, is that they will make improvements in the design and the building with the knowledge that they're going to have to maintain it. And through that process of linking all three of those elements of the project, it will wind up being cheaper and more cost effective and easier, because they've a vested interest in making it easier for themselves. So there's other things that are thrown out there. It's a fixed price contract. Any cost overruns they will absorb. It can't be late, or there will be financial penalties, so they have skin in the game. They've contributed some of their own money. Those are generally the arguments in favor of the P3. These projects have to have a profit element that the P3 projects, that the regular projects wouldn't have had. Now, I've got to qualify that. If it's the same people building it under both systems, then there's profit in those parts. So the profit is in the 30-year contract. The private sector is earning above and beyond the costs which add to the P3 element. And that's never transparent, what the profit element is in there. Another serious advantage is that the private sector, they're putting their money into it, but they're borrowing money at a rate, at one rate. The government generally can borrow money cheaper because the government is backed by, that loan is backed by the government, and the government won't disappear. Private sector will go out and borrow money at a higher rate, but we, through the lifetime of the contract, have to pay them back at that higher rate. So the cost of capital over time is higher. So there's those two added costs are the profit and the cost of capital that's necessarily higher in the private sector, which we pay back. So those are added costs to the whole process that don't become transparent in the documents that you see. You have to dig like crazy to find out what those are. Other disadvantages of the project, oh dear. Okay. The whole rationale for the project is that the value for money is better under the private sector option, the P3 option, than it is under the traditional build. Right? It's the holy grail, that value for money chart. I don't care what project it is, every single one of them has a value for money chart. Life is good. It says everything. It says at the end of the day that the P3 option is cheaper than the public option. But when you get right down to it, the reason that they're different is almost always because they've added a whole risk element. Because projects have a risk element to it. They've somehow magically, I'll come back and qualify the magic part. All you ever get to see in the public is this lump sum. In the case of the highway project, it's $476 million of risk was created out of thin air and then attached to the public cost. Up until that point, the public cost was cheaper than the private cost. And that's almost always the case. On a pure cost of construction, it's cheaper for the public than it is for the private. And then this massive risk number gets added and it completely flips. Now the private is cheaper than the public. The partners are all private. The contracts themselves, we can access most of the contracts. We'll find sections of it redacted. They just won't, they're FOIP'd right out. FOIP is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. What led them to the decision to go P3 in the first place? And how much was the value for money there? And how much was the expected contract there? So we're missing all kinds of information with the P3 because it's not a contested item.
What determines a project would be eligible for a P3?
A value for money approach, a value for money calculation, which has a whole whack of risk stuff in it. Absolutely, at the end of the day, they look at the size of the project. They generally have to be sizable. There's a certain minimum in terms of dollars, and that varies. I don't know what that number is, but size is a factor. And then they do a value for money approach, the one that we don't have for Regina bypass. If you look at the model that SAS Builds has, it has the request for proposal, request for qualifications, request for proposal, assessment, and contracts.
What determines how much the federal government will provide in funding?
Oh, okay. If it, and there's a whole apparatus set up in Ottawa, P3 Canada, which is given a whack of the public infrastructure money and told to dole it out. I think it's up to 20% of the project costs, but it has to go through this formal process of is it appropriate for a P3, but up to about 20%, I think.
Any person or group built in to oversee?
Yeah, they do create at least SAS Builds suggests they're only involved for a while. Whoever the thing is built for, I guess this would be the Minister of Highways, will have to. They're charged with monitoring and enforcing the contract to the life of the contract. See, how do you do a costing if you don't know the design? Right? And so how do you know what the private sector option is going to be until you have the design? That's why the earlier documents I was showing you were, well, here's the public sector cost, and we'll take 10% off, 15% off, 15% off. Here's the private sector costs. It's because they don't know the design yet. They're guessing at that point. That is one of the claimed benefits of a P3. We don't design, then build, then maintain separately. We do them all the same person. So they build in inefficiencies right across the system because they know they have to operate it at that end. So the design and build are generally done at the same time. Now, there's no reason we couldn't do that in the public sector too, because they're assuming that there's synergies, because we're going to, if we have to build it, we're going to factor that into our design. Right? So why doesn't the city or the province go out and get someone to build and design it at the same time? The same benefits are available. And this doesn't seem to be, it's not acknowledged at all in your value for money. Public incompetent can't do stuff, private competent can. There's no reason why you can't in the public sector combine these elements too, and then issue a contract with strict performance requirements and enforce them. You pretty much have the same thing. And that's what the Saskatchewan Auditor General is talking about. You seem to be assuming the public sector can't do stuff. And you seem to be learning this stuff that you could pass on to the public sector, but you're not. They're talking about SAS Builds in this case.
Okay.
And they could.
So do the bidders propose their own design and the way they can do it the cheapest? Is that how the design is selected?
Well, it depends. I mean, it has to meet minimum requirements. So the road requirements, or in the case of the wastewater thing, there were certain levels of effluent that were tolerable and would be tolerable over time. So they'd have to adhere to that. But within that, they have a wide range. Come back with different alternatives. Surprise us.
So how would this have affected the route selection of the Regina bypass?
You know, in that, I don't think it would have, I think the route was decided. And then it was presented to bidders. You wouldn't, I hope you wouldn't. You wouldn't turn that over to the private sector at all. No. Yeah, they wouldn't know what they were bidding on. And you get into land acquisition stuff, which they don't want to do. They're build highways. So it wouldn't have.
So they would have just been proposing the cheapest way to
build that route. And the route was given.
Okay. And how is it ensured that they wouldn't do cost cutting, cut around corners?
Well, the theory is if you do cost cutting up front, you're going to be paying for it for the next 30 years. And if you're the same people, you're self-motivated not to do that. And you have money in the game. And you could forfeit that money. $150 million less to build it in the public sector, which has been have them hire the same people to build it, because it's kind of strange. And then, pow, we got $476 million in risk, and the whole thing flipped. It just flipped it. Magic. How did they decide to go P3? They did a value for money report. Do we have it? Nope. Should we have it? Yep. And that's a critical piece of information. A critical piece of information. Okay. And it maybe take years to find it, which is the wrong part.